There are approximately 2 million South Asians in Canada who substantially contribute to the mosaic of identities, cultures, languages, and religions within Canada. While Canada has adopted multiculturalism as a virtue, tension in racial relations nevertheless still exists in Canadian society. The study of race relations is becoming increasingly relevant in Canadian society with the influx of immigrants in recent years. In Canada, the 4 largest racialized groups by population are Blacks, Indigenous, Chinese, and South Asians. Dr. Keith Neuman is a senior associate at the Environics Institute in Ottawa. In 2019, Dr. Neuman released Race Relations in Canada, a survey of Canadian public opinion and experience, where he outlined his research in the field. This was the first report of its kind in Canada. Dr. Neuman worked closely with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation to provide an in-depth and thorough analysis of race relations in his report. Today, Zain Malik of Canadian Immigration News is meeting virtually with Dr. Keith Neuman to discuss Neuman's research on race relations and how it relates to Canada's South Asian population. They will discuss racism towards the South Asian community, intersectional categorization, and the future of the South Asian community in Canada.
So we are joined here today by Dr. Keith Neuman of the Environics Institute of Canada. Dr. Neuman, how are you doing today?
I'm doing excellent. It's summer and most of us have vaccines and things are looking up. I hope you're doing the same.
Yes, it looks like Canada will finally, especially being in Ontario, we feel like it's now time for us to, go back to normal. All right.
We're hoping, yes.
Let's get straight into our discussion now. We've seen that Canada has adopted multiculturalism as somewhat of a virtue, and Canada has been celebrating diversity and inclusion for many years. However, this diversity comes at the cost of using all-fits-one terminologies, such as visible minorities, racialized minorities, and even attempts at accurately representing those minorities leads to further homogenization by using terms such as Asian, Black, South Asian, and Muslim. In your work as a researcher on race relations in specific, how have you mitigated the use of such terminologies?
Zain, that's a good question. Yes, it's a bit complicated and confusing to know how to label people and categorize them and so forth. And I don't think there's any perfect solution. I think that in our surveys, we typically ask people to self-identify how they would characterize or categorize themselves. And in most of our surveys, we use the questions that Statistics Canada has developed, for instance, for the census, which of course are not perfect, but are based on their understanding of the population, how it's changing. So I guess there are a couple of things. One, we can ask people how they would identify, and they can identify for themselves how they would characterize their racial background or their ethnic background and so forth. But when we're doing survey research and we're trying to understand groups, we have to boil things down to a workable number of groups. It may be that if you ask Canadians what term they would use, there might be 100 or 120 different terms people might use. It's very difficult to analyze data that way. So we tend to use broader categories. So for instance, one of the categories on the Stats Canada question is South Asian, which is defined in terms of certain countries and so forth. And so in our surveys, when we're looking at our results, we will look at the South Asian population as they've defined it. But understandably, we're asking people to identify as that versus something that would be very different. So it's by no means perfect, but it seems to work very well. And on our surveys, we get very, very few people that don't find themselves in one of the categories that we're presenting.
So would you say that for the purpose of analysis, for the purpose of statistics, these broad terminologies are kind of helping others in Canadian society be understood?
Well, I think so. I think there needs to be some coherent way to understand the population and its diversity in terms of identity and or background. And you want people to identify for themselves who they are, but we need to have some broad categories. So I think the ones that are often used, and by the population, there are four racialized populations that are by far the largest in the country. Excuse me. Those would be Indigenous, South Asian, Chinese, and Black. And those are large enough populations that they're important because of size, but they're also important because there is some coherence to identity with each one of those populations. We have done in-depth research with the Black community in the Toronto area, and we actually asked people in that survey what terms do they identify with, and almost most of them, not all of them, but most of them identified most closely with the term Black. So I think we know with that population that term has resonance and is used by the majority of people who might be either Black or African Canadian or of African heritage and so forth. So these are not perfect labels, but they're labels that I think, one, are useful in terms of understanding the population, and ones that I think these groups, from what we can tell, these populations themselves have either adopted for themselves or are reasonably comfortable with. There has been no controversy that I've heard recently about the use of such terms. I think in the Indigenous community, it used to be Aboriginals, and before Aboriginals, it used to be Indians, and so the terminology there is evolving over time.
Well, speaking of the evolution of terminologies, a widespread terminology that is used to describe people in Canada who follow the Islamic faith is the Muslim community. And a survey conducted by the institute that you represent, Environics Institute, found that Muslims are most widely considered to be the other in Canada. Why is that the case? Is there an inherently Western culture that enables this othering? Can a sense of religious belonging be in conflict with the secular ideas of Canada?
Well, it's a good question. We've done research with Muslims over the past 15 years, and we're in fact planning some more research in the next year or so. I think the othering of Muslims is not officially, that's not the label that Canadians might use. But I think it was clear through our research that despite the different ways of people coming from many countries and the multicultural aspect of the Canadian population, which is by no means new, I think the issue is that, as you know, Canada historically has been largely a Christian country. Most of the colonial founding peoples, Catholic or Protestant, and while that's no longer as much the case now as it was before, a large majority of Canadians are either still identify as Christian or I consider themselves to be secular. And that trend has been continuing for a number of years. So I think the issue with Islam and Muslims is that there is, over the past 20 years, a significant number of Muslims immigrating to Canada from many parts of the world. And I think because it's about religion and not ethnicity per se, it has been something different. I think that part of it is that it's a religion or a faith that's different and sometimes has been mischaracterized as problematic in certain of its practices or whatever. And I think it's also the case that in Canada, as Canada becomes more secular, I think religion in the public sphere is no longer as present, and many Canadians are not that comfortable in discussing or dealing with religion or people of other religions. This is particularly the case in Quebec. And I think that the challenges facing the Muslim community are clearly most significant in Quebec, and that is not by coincidence. As you know, Quebec used to be a highly Catholic country, but starting in the 60s, it rapidly changed to become the most secular part of Canada. And I think the situation in Quebec is partly because Quebec has such a well developed and I guess sort of protective culture and language, because it's French in a English-speaking continent, and because it's so secular. The arrival of a number of people from a very different type of religious faith, I think, is a challenge and maybe presents some discomfort to many people in that province. So that's where. So I think that the Muslims as part of Canada, because it seems different, and there's been some unfortunate stereotypes developed that, and because it's about religion, there's more discomfort about Muslims than there have been about people simply coming from another country who may have been Christian or some other language. And of course, we cannot discount the impact of terrorist incidents like 9/11, which again cast Muslims as the perpetrators unfairly. So that cast a whole narrative around Muslims being sort of a danger to the West, which has dissipated significantly, but there's still a vestige of that. So there has been progress over time. Our research has found that Canadians have become gradually more accustomed to and comfortable and supportive of Muslims in this country, which is a good sign. We have also found quite clearly that the more contact people, non-Muslims, have with Muslims, the more positive and supportive they are. And so much of the strongest resistance you can find in parts of the country that have the least contact. So this is a distant threat, not something that's happening in their neighborhood.
Well, sticking with that problem of Muslims not being able to integrate into Canadian society, your recent report on immigration and refugees found that 44% of Canadians believe that too many immigrants are not adopting Canadian values.
Right.
It is a downward trend, as we understand that Canadian immigration news. However, it still represents a large portion of the Canadian population.
Mm-hmm.
So in a multicultural Canada, what exactly are these Canadian values that Canadians expect immigrants to adopt?
Well, that's an interesting question. So this is some of the research that we've done and reported on. First, to explain the question, we have been asking this survey question of Canadians for about 30 years. We've been asking it year over year and seeing how this changes over time. And as you've said, the number of Canadians who agree with the statement, too many immigrants are not adopting Canadian values, has been going down over time. It's now as low as it's ever been. In the question, we did not actually define what we meant by values. Mm-hmm. I think that what we're doing is we're using that in a generic sense, and we're allowing Canadians to respond to the question and respond however they think that means. So we're not trying to be specific about this, but we're trying to get a sense. The question measures the extent to which Canadians feel that immigrants are not becoming Canadian enough. But we're not specifying it specifically. There's some other research that we've done, we've also reported on, where we've asked Muslim and non-Muslim, Native Canadians and immigrants, what is it that immigrants should be expected to do when they arrive in this country? And it's an open-ended question. So it's really getting at this issue of values. And what's interesting is Canadians, Muslim and non-Muslim, and Native Canadians and immigrants all identify the same things. Learning one of the official languages, obeying the laws, learning something about the history. Those are the things that both Muslims and non-Muslims identify to the same degree. So in fact, there is real alignment between what immigrants and non-immigrants are thinking what makes a good Canadian. But the popular idea, the notion, the concern that immigrants aren't integrating is still out there because it is a change. Some people feel threatened. And some people feel threatened by certain kinds of immigrants. It may be a different religion. It may be because they believe that immigrants somehow are not learning the language, they're not becoming employed, they're causing crime to increase. There's no real evidence for these things in reality, but there are all kinds of concerns and issues that some Canadians have. And I should point out that this dynamic is apparent in every so-called Western country, and in fact is much less evident in Canada than it is in the United States or Britain or France. So in fact, in relative terms, Canadians are more comfortable with immigrants and so forth than in most other sort of comparative countries.
So I have a question in regards to an overlap between certain terminologies that are used within your research. For instance, does the idea of a Muslim overlap or the idea of someone who's South Asian as well? And well, South Asia is itself a very diverse region,
Right.
comprising of different religious ethnicities, identities, languages. So is there an overlap sometimes when Environics Institute is conducting their research between?
Well, one of the benefits of doing survey research is you can identify the various identities and look at the intersectionality amongst those identities if you have a large enough sample of people that you survey. That's oftentimes a challenge because it's you need a very large survey to have enough, for instance, Muslims to look at South Asian Muslims versus Middle East Muslims versus Southeast Asia and so forth. And in our research to date with Muslims, we have not been able to bring this up large enough to be able to break the Muslim population down enough to really do a proper analysis by these different ethnicities. Now, we have the ethnicities represented in our samples, but you need a large enough subsample to actually do an analysis. And I guess maybe I can close this by saying that we do have plans to do a new survey of Muslims in 2022 and 2023, and we will be increasing the sample significantly. And we are hoping to be able to do more to look at the overlapping identities for that particular survey. I think that the challenge with surveys in general is that when you're dealing with sort of small subpopulations in Canada, it's difficult sometimes to cover them well enough in surveys to do justice to the result. But our institute, we push the envelope on that as much as we can. And so, for instance, a number of our recent surveys on broader topics, race relations, the pandemic, we have oversampled South Asians and Blacks, Indigenous and Chinese, unlike most surveys. And so we now regularly look at the perspectives of these different groups on many of the issues in this country today and can speak to whether there is similarity or difference across them.
Well, sticking with South Asians as a subgroup, population subgroup, a survey found that 3 in 4 of the respondents believed that South Asians experience discrimination in Canada. And South Asians were identified amongst the 4 races most discriminated against. Yet when Environics Institute came out with a report on racism and discrimination, which was released in October 2020, more focus was given to Black and the Chinese community and not on South Asians. So my question is, does Canada neglect this discrimination South Asians face, perhaps?
Yes, let me address that. I think first, we've looked at this on a number of surveys, and we just completed a new one this spring, which we'll be releasing in a month or two on this topic. So I think that we focused on perceptions of discrimination against the largest sort of racialized groups by population, including South Asian, Chinese, Indigenous, and Black. Those are the four largest. We also looked at East and Southeast Asian people with East and Southeast Asian backgrounds this time as well as people from the Middle East and Latin America. So our findings consistently show that Canadians are most likely to believe that there is discrimination experienced by people who are Black or Indigenous compared to other racialized groups. And our research also confirms that, in fact, those are the groups that are most likely to report discrimination. So clearly, the two in the country that do stand out as experiencing discrimination because of race or ethnic background. However, significant numbers of Canadians also believe that South Asians and Chinese experience discrimination, not to the same degree, but still to significant numbers, as you've mentioned. I think 3/4, depends on which question you use. And a significant minority of South Asians report discrimination. So I think it's a matter of degree. I think that there is awareness that South Asians experience this as well, but they're not as likely to be seen to be. And South Asians themselves are not as likely to report it as Black and Indigenous. So there is a difference in relative terms. But I think that there is widespread perceptions among other Canadians that South Asians do experience this as well. And I think that's actually increased over the past 2 years with the new data that we have. So it's a matter of degree.
Well, we as South Asians, Canadians continue to believe that they do experience discrimination.
Yes.
However, the Environics Institute report highlights that South Asians are most likely to be positive about race relations. What is the cause of this optimism? Despite the discrimination, there seems to be in Canada a belief in racial relations.
Yeah.
So what do you think is the cause of this optimism?
Well, that's good. And again, the optimism is relative. It's not that all South Asians are positive, but when you compare their perspective to others, and we asked a question about the future of race relations and whether people are optimistic or pessimistic about real progress. We found in this study, and we found in some other studies, that South Asians actually stand out. And I think that what we found is that South Asians as a group, subpopulation, tend to have actually the highest levels of education, university education of any group, including white Canadians. So South Asians actually stand out to some respects in that respect. We completed a study of youth, Canadians aged 18 to 40, looking at the millennial and Gen Z generations. And we found that the South Asian youth really stand out compared to youth from all of the other groups in this country as being higher levels of life satisfaction, generally more optimistic about their lives and about the way things are heading. And the difference in secondary education really stands out. So, South Asian, the younger generations of South Asians in Canada really seem to be thriving the most. And this may explain why they are more positive than others about the future. Now, why they have more education or what else is behind this, we really can't tell from our data. And I think this is where we would invite others, including South Asian scholars, maybe to look at our data more closely and bring some valuable context into what we're finding. Because, I'm not sure we have the whole story, but what I can say is the data, the results are very robust. They show very clear differences over a couple of surveys.
All right. So coming back to the collective racial relationships between racialized minorities, the majority population, the relationship between racialized minorities, there seems to be, again, optimism that racial issues will diminish over time, if I understand correctly. However, there's still a problem of symbolic racism, as you've identified in one of your reports. So would you care to elaborate on what symbolic racism is, how it's different from racism, and does it, in a sense, kind of promote identity politics?
Well, we use the term symbolic racism. The term that we focus on in our report is modern racism, which is something very different from identity politics. Modern racism is a concept that was developed in the United States in the last number of decades. And modern racism is distinguished from what I guess is called classic racism. Classic racism is where individuals or groups might have negative perceptions or attitudes towards another race, and it would involve considering the individuals inferior or problematic or dangerous, as people of X and X race are less intelligent, create crime, and so forth. That's sort of the classic racism that has been around for way too long. Modern racism is a more contemporary concept that shifts from attitudes towards individuals in a group to the group as a whole, and involves attitudes, for instance, saying that a certain group is getting more than it deserves in society. So for instance, people who might be Black or Indigenous are benefiting from too many government programs, or the media is treating them better than they should be. So it's still racist, and it's still negative stereotypes, but the focus is shifting more about the groups and their place in society. In other words, they have a place in society they don't deserve, rather than they are inferior people. And so it is more, a little more politically correct, if you will, a little more socially acceptable to complain about a certain group getting more than it deserves than to say members of those groups aren't fully human. So that's what modern racism is. So in our 2019 survey, we asked some questions to measure that. And we could see that there's some range in the level of attitudes that Canadians have. So some portion, a minority of Canadians, about maybe 1 in 5 or so, 1 in 4, have what we might call modern racist attitudes. Certain groups get more than they deserve and so forth. And I might say that that's more likely to be the case directed at Asian South Asian and Chinese, because those groups aren't as likely to be seen as suffering from discrimination or racism. So more Canadians might believe that they're actually doing pretty good and getting more than they deserve. So that's sort of what modern racism is about. Identity politics is really something quite different, and that involves, sort of looking at everything through the lens of racial groups, dismissing the fact that there are other factors that have a role in society, such as socioeconomic income and so forth. So we did not address identity politics in our research. So that's really quite a distinct concept. I hope I've explained that.
Of course, that was a great answer. So just before we end our conversation, would you like to give a word of advice to new South Asian immigrants coming to Canada and what they can likely expect from Canadian society?
Well, that's an excellent question. I haven't really thought about it. I think that that's a good question. I think that, the South Asian community is very well established in Canada. It's been here for many, many decades. And so the community is here, and new South Asians will benefit from those people already here. I expect that people may be arriving with the idea that Canada is some paradise of multicultural diversity and acceptance. And I think that they will find that that's not quite the case, that there is racism and there is exclusion and so forth that happens. But it's a matter of degree. And I think that it's a question, I guess, of what your tolerance is and what you're expecting. What we found from our research is that most Canadians and racialized Canadians believe that relations between different groups is fairly positive. In other words, what we're not seeing in our research is the belief that there is significant group racial tension between different groups, that somehow there's a clear animosity between this group and that group. Our research tells us that very, very few Canadians feel that's what's happening in Canada or in their community. So the form of racism and intolerance is fairly subtle and is somewhat under the surface. And people may find difficulty with that, but at least it's not in your face. And there are laws and policies in place that have some impact. I think for South Asians that move into the major cities, we'll see very diverse populations living comfortably together. You see very little evidence of enclaves for the most part, where people from different ethnicities and races are sort of sequestered, which is unlike many other countries. So I think that there's much more of an upside than a downside, all things being equal. I will also say that from our research, it's evident to us that younger generations have higher expectations and lower tolerance for intolerance and racism than older generations. And this is particularly true for people born in this country, second generation Canadians. But my guess is that newcomers coming to this country, the younger ones will likely have a higher expectation. And then their children in this country will have higher expectations. And the bar will go higher. What they accepted when they first arrived will no longer be acceptable 10 years, 20 years later. So I think the country is progressing, maybe with fits and starts, but I think the evidence is that the country is becoming more accepting over time, gradually. But I think public expectations and expectations of people from racialized groups are probably increasing faster than the actual progress. That creates some tension.
So on that positive note, this has been Dr. Keith Neuman with us at Canadian Immigration News. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Thank you.